The wind moves like a whisper across the Cape frontier, bending thorny shrubs until they look like a restless sea. A rider sits high in the saddle, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun bleeds into violet shadows. Behind him, a modest whitewashed farmhouse breathes with the sounds of evening wood crackling in the hearth. A child softly reciting a catechism, the steady scratch of a quill as a father tallies his household on the annual tax roll. The list is stark: cattle, sheep, wagons, rifles, and the names of those whose labor anchors the farm family and the enslaved alike. In one corner of the room, a chipped bottle bears a French crest, relic of ancestors who once fled across oceans, seeking freedom. Here, survival is a calculation written not in law but in distance. The company in Cape Town may stamp its decrees, yet on the open horizon, the true laws are thirst, pasture, and the speed of a horse's hooves. When drought presses too close, families hitch their wagons and move. When raiders appear by moonlight, neighbors gather into commandos, rifles balanced against prayer. And in every household ledger, faith and fear are recorded together, each line an uneasy balance between providence and necessity. The mentality that grew here was not invented overnight. It was hammered slowly into shape by the land, by the company, by war, and by worship. To understand these settlers, one must ask, what exactly formed their inner weather, their reflexes, their habits of mind? Just as the valley seems to rest in twilight, a distant horn cuts the air, a reminder that this story begins not with peace, but with the relentless terms of survival. Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is Missing History Records. To understand why these early settlers thought the way they did, one must first grasp what was at risk. At the Cape, nothing was guaranteed. Not the rains, not the harvest, not the safety of a herd left grazing beyond sight. Each season could bring abundance or ruin, and each decision carried the weight of survival. A poorly chosen spring could wither into dust. A single raid could scatter years of labor. A poor harvest might leave a family dependent on neighbors or at the mercy of company stores. This fragile balance extended beyond the land itself. Settlers lived between two worlds, the corporate authority of the Dutch East India Company, whose distant decrees reached only weakly into the frontier, and the older claims of indigenous communities whose presence preceded them. Every fence line and every borrowed pasture risked sparking conflict, and with each expansion came the unspoken knowledge that the frontier was shared, not emptied. Within the household, the stakes were no less profound. Families measured prosperity in the number of wagons, rifles, or cattle they possessed, but equally in the obedience of their children, the labor of the enslaved, and the blessing of providence. To falter in one was to falter in all. In this crucible, identity itself was at stake: who belonged, who commanded, who survived. The settler's mentality, then, was not an abstract philosophy. It was a shield forged against loss, a habit of vigilance in a land that demanded constant negotiation. And just as patterns seemed to stabilize, a new change in the colony would shift the ground beneath their feet. For what began as a mere refreshment station soon grew into something larger, an entire society, restless and expanding, where context would shape every thought and choice. The Cape began as little more than a pit stop on the world's busiest sea route. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company raised its flag at Table Bay, expecting nothing more than gardens and storehouses to provision passing ships. The plan was simple: feed the sailors, repair their vessels, keep the trade flowing toward the riches of the East. Yet distance quickly mocked the neatness of corporate design. Company gardens faltered in the rocky soil, herds dwindled. Passing fleets demanded more than the station could produce. Necessity forced the director's hand, and servants were released as free burghers, granted small plots of land. In those modest beginnings lay the seed of a settler colony. The moment was decisive. A supply post became a community, and a community became a society. But this growth was never neutral. From the very first, it entangled settlers with both the land and those who already lived upon it. Indigenous Khoikhoi communities traded cattle and knowledge of pasture, yet their livelihoods were quickly strained by demands for stock and land. Tensions erupted in the very first decade. In 1659, coordinated raids under the leadership of Duman made it clear that the frontier would not expand without resistance. Warfare and alliance interlaced, shaping mental habits of vigilance and mistrust. At the same time, another thread wound its way into the colony: slavery. In 1658, the Amherst Fort brought the first enslaved captives to Table Bay. They came from Angola, India, Madagascar, and the Indonesian archipelago. Drawn into households as cooks, artisans, and field laborers, their presence was intimate, woven into kitchens, vineyards, and workshops. They altered speech, recipes, and songs, giving birth to a Creole culture even as they lived under coercion. Families learned to think of prosperity as unthinkable without the labor of others, and this too shaped mentality at its deepest core. Into this mixture came a community of exiles, the Huguenots. Fleeing persecution in France, they arrived in 1688 and were scattered among Dutch farms to prevent them from forming their own enclave. Within a generation, their language had faded, yet their piety, viticulture, and sense of chosen endurance were absorbed into the broader colonial self-image. A chipped wine bottle in a Drakenstein cellar or a family Bible with French inscriptions became heirlooms of both hardship and resilience. By the dawn of the 18th century, a quiet revolution in land tenure reshaped the colony. Instead of tight freehold plots, families now occupied vast lone farms leases with vague boundaries that stretched across rivers and valleys. This looseness favored mobility and improvisation. If land dried or neighbors pressed too close, a wagon could be loaded and the household pushed further into the interior. Autonomy grew in the gaps between company law and the realities of distance. Out of these layers corporate control and its limits, indigenous resistance and fragile alliances, slavery at the heart of households, exile turned into endurance, and land tenure that rewarded mobility. Settler mentalities took form. They were not abstract theories, but the living reflexes of people who prayed, fought, bartered, and wandered at the edge of empire. And within these circumstances, settlers forged not just habits, but entire ways of seeing the world measured. In sermons, in tax rolls, in saddlebags, and in the restless movements of families chasing survival. On parchment in Amsterdam, the Cape was a business. The directors of the Dutch East India Company imagined balance sheets filled with wine, wheat, and salted meat for passing fleets. Their ordinances stretched across oceans like invisible chains. The price of bread, the measure of a barrel, the rules for a vineyard. But parchment and reality rarely aligned. The further a wagon rolled from Table Bay, the fainter the company's grasp became. Out on the farms, authority dissolved into a negotiation between distant officials, local congregations, and household patriarchs. It was within this triangle that settler mentality began to take shape. The Dutch Reformed Church offered more than sermons. It provided rhythm, order, and a way to read the uncertainties of frontier life. A summer drought could be cast as divine chastisement, a sudden recovery of herds as providential mercy. Baptism, marriage, and burial bound families to one another through ritual, even as they lived scattered across valleys. Ministers became interpreters of both scripture and survival, shaping how people explained fortune and misfortune. Beside the Bible lay another book, the annual Opgaf, the tax roll. Each year, households reported their cattle, wagons, rifles, children, and the enslaved men and women who formed the foundation of their labor. It was a record for company officials, but it also trained settlers to see the world as a ledger. To be respectable was to be orderly. To list without omission was to prove one's place in society. Yet this discipline carried a shadow. By writing, human beings in the same columns as livestock and tools. Settlers absorbed a mindset where hierarchy and property blended seamlessly. The company itself encouraged this mixture of obedience and evasion. Families learned when to comply and when to quietly bend the rules. A regulation might be observed when inspectors were near, ignored when distance made oversight impossible. Taxes could be delayed, trade conducted informally. The ethic that emerged was not lawless, yet not law-bound either. It was pragmatic, wary, and shaped by the constant pressure to survive on the edge of empire. Faith and bookkeeping, piety and pragmatism, these were not opposites, but companions in the settler household. Every prayer over bread was echoed by a tally in the ledger. Every sermon reinforced the conviction that prosperity was both divine blessing and careful management. This dual covenant with God and with the company defined the mental architecture of the frontier farmer, but sermons and ledgers could only guide so far. When the land itself refused to yield, or neighbors pressed too close, settlers turned to something new, a world of open horizons and lone farms that carried them beyond the limits of company order. Beyond the reach of Cape Town's walls, the land unfolded in vast, irregular patterns. Here, the neat European ideal of fixed boundaries quickly gave way to something looser, born of necessity. By the early years of the 18th century, Dutch East India Company shifted from granting small, secure plots to issuing lone farms leases with boundaries so vague they were often marked by a river, a hill, or nothing more than the memory of a surveyor's words. For the settlers, this vagueness was not a problem, but an opportunity. It allowed flexibility, movement, and the chance to expand into landscapes where company officials rarely traveled in practice. A lone farm was less a piece of land than a license to improvise. Families learned to think in cycles of pasture and water rather than in the straight lines of fences. When winter rains greened the valleys, herds grazed near home. When the summer sun burned the soil, wagons creaked outward to new grazing grounds. A mentality of mobility took hold. Prosperity was not found in permanence but in the ability to adapt, to hitch a team of oxen and move when the land demanded it. This mobility forged independence. A farmer could not wait for instructions from a distant company clerk when cattle grew thin or neighbors contested a stream. Decisions had to be made on the spot, often enforced by little more than determination and a rifle slung across the saddle. Suspicion of distant authority grew naturally from this life. Company rules were acknowledged, but only as far as they were practical. Beyond that, settlers trusted their own judgment, their neighbors, and the knowledge of the terrain itself. The rhythm of the frontier also shaped family life. Women managed households that doubled as fortress and workshop, turning scarcity into skill. Children were raised not just in catechisms, but in the geography of springs and grazing paths, learning early which valleys promised grass and which tracks led only to dust. This education of necessity built a culture that prized resilience, thrift, and a wary eye on the horizon, yet the freedom of lone farms carried hidden costs. As wagons pushed further outward, the frontier pressed into territories long occupied by indigenous communities. To settlers, land seemed open for the taking. To the Khoisan and other groups, it was intrusion into grazing and hunting grounds that had sustained their way of life for generations. The ambiguity that protected settlers from company oversight sharpened conflict with those whose claims could not be erased by ink or decree. Thus, the open horizon was both promise and peril. It gave settlers autonomy and the illusion of endless space, but it also bred the tensions that would define the Cape's frontier for centuries. In the minds of those who lived it, movement became second nature, and mobility itself a kind of law, but wagons and cattle were only half the story. At the center of every household stood another force, quieter yet more enduring slavery, whose labor and presence shaped the very rhythm of settler life. If the open horizon gave settlers mobility, It was slavery that gave their households permanence. From the very first arrival of captives in 1658, unfree labor became the heartbeat of the Cape Colony. Unlike the vast plantations of the Americas, slavery here unfolded within the intimacy of the household. Kitchens, vineyards, workshops, and corrals all bore the mark of enslaved hands. Every loaf of bread, every stitched harness, every bottle of wine carried within it the unseen imprint of lives bound in service. The enslaved came from across the Indian Ocean world, Angola, Madagascar, India, the Indonesian archipelago each. Arrival bringing new tongues, new recipes, new songs. Over time, their presence transformed the colony's culture, giving rise to a Creole mixture in speech, food, and faith. Spices simmered in stews, lullabies borrowed words from distant coasts, and gardens held plants carried across seas. Yet this creativity bloomed within walls of coercion. Punishment was harsh, freedom elusive, and even small acts of resistance risked retribution. For settlers, the household ledger blurred the line between human and property. Each year in the Opgaf, men and women were listed beside wagons and cattle. Their names reduced to numbers, their lives translated into columns of value. Respectability for a settler meant order, and order demanded discipline of children, of herds, and above all of the enslaved. The mentality that emerged naturalized hierarchy. To command was to care, to provide shelter was to demand obedience. And prosperity was measured in both livestock and lives owned. Yet enslaved people were never passive. They negotiated for better conditions, slowed their work as subtle protest, and carved spaces of autonomy within the very system meant to control them. Some escaped into the rugged interior, relying on distance to conceal them. Others maintained fragments of their heritage songs whispered after dark, prayers spoken quietly, recipes carried from memory. In these acts lay defiance and the preservation of identity, even under the weight of bondage. This dynamic shaped settler mentality in profound ways. Living so closely with enslaved people instilled both dependency and fear. Dependency, because daily life relied on their labor. Fear, because resistance was always possible. This tension bred a psychology of vigilance within the home itself, reinforcing the same watchfulness that the frontier demanded outside. Households became microcosms of empire, sites of faith. Labor and hierarchy intertwined. A settler might kneel with his family at evening prayers, reading from scripture that spoke of deliverance, only to rise and enforce discipline upon those denied that same freedom. Such contradictions hardened into habit, creating a moral logic that justified authority as both natural and necessary. And when danger threatened from beyond the homestead's fence, this household order expanded outward, turning neighbors into patrols and families into militias, the commando system that carried fear and discipline into the open veldt. The Cape frontier was never quiet for long. Beyond the kraals and orchards stretched lands where settlers and indigenous communities lived in uneasy proximity. Trade might flourish one season, only to dissolve into raids the next. Cattle, the lifeblood of both, became the most frequent prize and the most constant spark of violence. To protect themselves, settlers turned to a system that became second nature, the commando. The commando was not a standing army, but a call to neighbors. At the sound of a horn or the flicker of a lantern across a ridge, men gathered, mounted, and rode. Each brought his own musket, powder, and provisions. They were bound less by company command than by necessity and trust. Here, survival required speed and cohesion. When tracks were spotted in the dust, or smoke curled from a distant valley, the commando answered with pursuit. For those who grew up in this world, the commando became more than defense, it was a rite of passage. Boys learned to read hoofprints before they could read books, taught to tell the difference between a stray cow and a raiding party by the shape of a trail. Women, though left at home, felt the weight of this system too, standing watch over farms, that might at any moment fall within the cycle of reprisal. Every raid and counter-raid etched deeper into memory the belief that vigilance was not optional, but essential. This militarized rhythm left its mark on settler mentality. It cultivated a habit of suspicion, a reflex to strike first rather than wait, and a deep reliance on kin and neighbors over distant officials. It reinforced the household's discipline with the discipline of the saddle, extending authority from the farmstead to the open veldt. Violence became normalized, not as a matter of cruelty alone, but as the accepted language of security. The commando also fostered a mythic self-image. Victories were celebrated as providential, losses interpreted as trials of faith. Stories of narrow escapes and daring raids circulated around family tables, passed down as warnings and lessons. Over time, these tales hardened into a tradition that cast the settler not merely as farmer but as warrior, a defender of home and faith against a landscape imagined as perilous. Yet this same tradition deepened divides. Each ride widened the gulf between settler and indigenous. Each reprisal made reconciliation harder. What settlers thought of as survival, others experienced as encroachment and dispossession. The language of fear preserved communities in the short term, but it also ensured that the frontier would never be a place of lasting peace. And when the echoes of these night rides faded into memory, what remained was not just the sound of hooves, but a mentality, an inheritance of faith, order, hierarchy, and fear that would echo far beyond the frontier itself. When the dust of those early centuries began to settle, what endured was not only farms and vineyards, but a way of thinking. Settler mentality had become a structure, resilient enough to outlast the company that first planted its flag at Table Bay. Even after British banners replaced Dutch ones in the 19th century, the habits of mind forged on the frontier continued to shape the colony's destiny. At the heart of this legacy was a preference for local autonomy. Families who had learned to survive on their own terms carried forward a suspicion of distant authority. Company rules had once seemed irrelevant beyond a day's ride from Cape Town, and later imperial decrees often met the same fate, the memory of wagons pushing outward, of decisions made in isolation, instilled a lasting confidence in local judgment over metropolitan command. Equally enduring was the household order, built upon hierarchy. Slavery, though eventually abolished, left behind a deep imprint. Generations of settlers had grown accustomed to seeing authority exercised as both natural and necessary, embedded in family life and reinforced by scripture. That logic of command outlived the institution itself, shaping social relations and ideas of respectability. Long after the chains were gone, the commando tradition also cast a long shadow. What had begun as improvised defense became a cultural template, courage defined in terms of vigilance, identity bound to the readiness to ride at night. The mythic stories of those rides became part of settler memory, reinforcing the self-image of resilience and divine favor. But this legacy was not singular. For descendants of the enslaved and the dispossessed, memory carried different meanings. The silence of names lost to ledgers, the dislocation of ancestral lands, the survival of songs and prayers whispered against the weight of authority. The Cape's history is thus layered, one legacy of autonomy and endurance, another of exclusion and loss. And so the question lingers, if mentality is an inheritance, how do we reckon with what was passed down, not only the resilience but the shadows it cast across centuries? Stand once more in the evening hush of the Cape. The ledgers are closed, the lamp burns low, and the oxen shift quietly in their stalls. Yet if you listen closely, the past still stirs. A prayer in Dutch lingers beside a lullaby carried from across the Indian Ocean. A story of a raid rides on the wind, mingling with the creak of wagon wheels and the faint crackle of a distant fire. In the silence of the landscape, the echoes of sermons, songs, and hoofbeats remain. What shaped early settler mentalities was never a single moment, but the slow convergence of land, faith, labor, and fear. These forces carved a way of thinking that reached far beyond its own century, shaping families, communities, and identities long after the original frontier had faded. To remember it now is to face both resilience and rupture, both survival and dispossession. The echoes are not confined to history books. They live in landscapes, in memory, and in the questions we still ask about who we are and how we came to be.